Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Crowder's Corner here on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. I'm Mike Crowder. Today is Wednesday, September 9th, 2020. The NFL season begins tomorrow night, Thursday night, with the Kansas City Chiefs, the defending Super Bowl champions, taking on the Houston Texans. This has been a very difficult and turbulent year here in the United States of America with COVID-19, with natural disasters, including the tornadoes that struck the state of Tennessee here in early March, and also with the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, other incidents of shootings by police officers of African American suspects, most of whom were unarmed, and the protests and demonstrations that followed. Now, the issue I want to talk about today is kneeling during the national anthem, which is what many NFL players and coaches, African American and otherwise, are going to do beginning Thursday night and beginning with this first week of the NFL season. Now, let's be clear. You can support steps toward reducing police brutality toward African Americans, unarmed African Americans. Also, you can be in favor of reducing racial injustice and bringing an end to systemic racism. At the same time, you can also support law enforcement. You can oppose defunding the police and defunding law enforcement, and also you can condemn the violence and looting and rioting that has taken place during these otherwise peaceful protests and demonstrations with groups including Black Lives Matter. That's the group that's leading many of the demonstrations and protests that have mostly been peaceful, but they have been hijacked, obviously, by individuals and groups who are bent on lawlessness, chaos, anarchy, and destruction. Also, physical harm and even shooting other people. And they don't care who George Floyd is. Of course, George Floyd was the suspect who was arrested by Minneapolis police and murdered by a Minneapolis police officer who held his knee on Floyd's throat for at least 3 minutes while Floyd was pleading with him that he couldn't breathe. Now, getting back to to what's going to happen beginning tomorrow night, Thursday night, as the NFL season begins, and that is players and coaches kneeling during the national anthem. Now, this is my opinion, and could be my opinion only. I hope not, but it could be. I think these players and coaches should do something as an alternative to kneeling during the national anthem. We know that, with the exception of the Green Bay Packers, every NFL franchise represents a major metropolitan area in the United States. What these players and coaches should do is go into these minority neighborhoods and communities, get residents, business owners, local law enforcement that patrol those communities and neighborhoods, and local elected officials, and facilitate and organize meetings involving all four of those groups that I just mentioned. One meeting's probably not going to be enough. Meet on a regular basis so you can understand the challenges that each group faces, the fear and the mistrust that, for example, minority residents have toward law enforcement. And come up with some very specific long-term solutions to the problems of police brutality and racial injustice, particularly police brutality. And of course, one idea that has been implemented in some police departments but needs to be implemented in all police departments is either not hiring or firing police officers who go rogue and are the subject of sometimes a dozen or more complaints from citizens who they come across, whether they're suspects, whether they're racially profiled, whatever the case may be. Those police officers don't need to be police officers anymore if they are already, and they can't be jumping from one jurisdiction to another in different municipalities, counties, states, whatever the case may be. We need them out of law enforcement. Now, the other problem, and I don't know that it's a problem necessarily, but it is an issue. Kneeling during the national anthem to protest police brutality, racial injustice, and systemic racism is something that is, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Ambiguous, and it is open to interpretation. And as we saw in 2016, when Colin Kaepernick became the first NFL player to kneel during the national anthem, millions of NFL fans who are very patriotic, whether you agree with them or not, they interpreted kneeling during the national anthem as being insults, and also as being really, now I'm at a loss for words again. Okay. They feel like it is a sign of insult and outright disrespect for the flag, military veterans, law enforcement, and others in position of authority. Now, I support the right of NFL players to kneel during the national anthem as a symbolic protest, and I understand why they do it. But again, it's ambiguous and it's open to interpretation, as we've seen, as we saw in 2016 and 2017. We're going to see that again during 2020, starting with tomorrow night's game between the defending Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs and the Houston Texans, where millions of very patriotic NFL fans are going to see kneeling during the national anthem as insulting and also disrespecting the flag, military veterans, and police officers. Now, again, whether you agree with that or not, that's reality. And that criticism is going to be led, as we know from 2017, by President Donald Trump. We've already heard from his son, Eric Trump, who's basically launching a boycott of the NFL season. We'll see how many people actually participate in that. 2016, 2017, there were some NFL fans who stopped watching the games on television and going to the games in person. Now, this year, we're not going to have any fans for the most part. Maybe later in the season, there will be some fans in the stadiums, but millions are still going to be watching on ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, and ESPN. And of course, because this is a news story, and politics and sports will never be separated, ever. And the cameras are definitely going to show players kneeling during the national anthem. And so that's the issue we face. And since I only have a minute left, I'm not going to, again, repeat what I said that NFL players should do as an alternative to kneeling during the national anthem. But this is something that we need to prepare for. And yes, we need to address the problems of police brutality, racial injustice, systemic racism, but we also need to be sensitive to those who are very patriotic. And most of us support the American flag. Most of us support law enforcement. Most of us support the military. But again, it's going to be a very tense situation. You're going to have the president and others who are going to be taking to social media to voice their criticism toward this effort. Well, that concludes this week's edition of Crowder's Corner here on LinkedIn. I'm Mike Crowder.